Today, I want to ask a few key questions about what do we know about human evolution. Many questions remain. 1. Although by 300,000 years ago, humans pretty much looked like us, at what point did they begin to act like us? 2. Given that Homo erectus and archaics were so widely spread across the world, where did Homo sapiens arise? And 3, taking the long view of hominin evolution, what can we say about the rate of evolution? I'll begin by addressing the question, when did humans start acting like humans? Modern human behavior is thought to include sophisticated cognitive and instrumental skill, social organization, and fully developed symbol use. The problem is, how do you decide when fully developed symbol use occurs? Let's take a quick look back in time. Between 7 and 5 million years ago, the first hominins originated in Africa, and they became habitual bipeds who still climbed trees. By 3.3 million years ago, still only in Africa, hominins were making crude stone tools and still sometimes climbing trees. But by 2.1 million years ago, humans were on the ground and they spread from Africa into Asia and eventually into Europe with control of fire, language, hunting, clothing, and shelters. And by 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans are found in northeastern Africa. However, we disagree on when, where, and how anatomically modern Homo sapiens achieved behavioral modernity, not just physical. When did they begin relying on symbolic thought, elaborating cultural creativity? In other words, becoming fully human in behavior. The traditional view is that modern behavior originated recently, around 40,000 years ago, only after modern humans had arrived in Europe. The name given to the first cultural period of modern behavior in Europe is called the Upper Paleolithic, and in Africa is called the Late Stone Age. The development and elaboration of human societies is the topic of the last third of the semester, but here is a short teaser. Arguments have been put forth to support the idea that modern behavior among humans is not seen until 40,000 years ago in Europe. It's at 40,000 years ago we see a kind of a creative explosion in Europe. By 35,000 years ago, we see an increase in the frequency of burials, and burials start to have grave goods, that is, items buried with the body. Between 32 and 10,000 years ago, we see carved figurines, and from almost 41,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, we find cave paintings. Personal ornaments also increased in frequency, as did the widespread use of color, for example, using ochre to paint things red. Now, however, we recognize this view as Eurocentrism, that is, that we ignore evidence for early behavioral complexity when it comes from Africa or the Middle East. And instead, we find a growing body of evidence for an older, more gradual evolution of modern behavior outside of Europe, rather than its sudden appearance in Europe. For example, Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating between 100 to 70,000 years ago, where we find ochre engraved. Also, Deep Kloof rock shelter in South Africa, dating from 109,000 to 52,000 years ago, where we find engraved ostrich eggshells. What do these engravings mean? As Thailand and others point out, human thoughts and intentions do not fossilize, and it is thus a major challenge to discern if the Blombos and Deep Kloof engravings were made for aesthetic appreciation, or were they made to serve as markers of group identity, or were they for the symbolic communication that we associate with modern human behavior? This shows you a map of where these two sites are located, as well as pictures of some of the engraved artifacts from each site. Based on modern experiments, these researchers conclude that yes, these were made for aesthetic appreciation, and possibly they may have served as markers of group identity, but they really can't tell whether they were used for symbolic communication, that is, the extreme marker of modern human behavior. So did modern human behavior begin 80,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago? Was it in Africa, the Middle East, or Europe? And why did people change? Was it due to population increase? Was it competition with non-modern humans? Was it a genetic mutation? Was there some kind of change in brain structure or brain organization? New findings from Africa help us discern what might have been going on. We're now finding artifacts thought to indicate the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, much earlier in Africa than in Europe, but not everywhere in Africa. We find a gradual accumulation of these artifacts, indicating a period of gradual cultural development. And we're finding not just blades, but other technological innovations thought to be related to the Upper Paleolithic revolution in Europe. In Africa, earlier than in Europe, we're finding blades made with the soft hammer technique of flint knapping. We're finding inscrapers for making leather. We're finding burin, that is, sharp-edged instruments for engraving. We're finding a range of bone tools, such as awls that you would make for sewing clothing, and spear points. We're finding microliths made from prepared cores and inserted into bone. And we're finding ornaments, such as beads, the use of colors, such as ochre, and evidence of trade. For example, at the Clayses Rivermouth site in South Africa, we find 100,000-year-old blade tools. Here, Homo sapiens were seasonally occupying the mouth of caves, hunting and fishing. So our updated hypothesis is that modern humans who appear in northern Africa by 300,000 years ago finally dispersed into Europe and Asia only 80 to 60,000 years ago. Approximately when modern human behavior is first seen in East and South Africa, and when rapid environmental change is occurring. So all we can do is hypothesize why, and why then. One hypothesis states that with these new technologies, these modern humans were much better at extracting resources, leading to a population increase among them. A second hypothesis that's not totally unrelated is that low population density would have been a barrier to the spread of ideas and cultural practices, whereas increasing population density could have put pressure on the living conditions of these early anatomically modern humans. People would begin to live nearer to each other, and so they would need to signal and communicate who belonged to which group from a distance. For example, body ornamentation could signal to somebody that you did or did not belong to their group. What kind of evidence do we have to support this? Well, around 44,000 years ago in the Mideast and around the Mediterranean and in Africa, people began wearing more beads and shell ornaments with designs etched in them. Hypothesis number 3 states that it's not due to population increase, but to increasing social competition. So we don't find much human ornamentation back in Africa or the Middle East until these people face new circumstances in Europe, including meeting and competing with the archaic populations in Europe. And yet a fourth hypothesis that is somewhat related says that humans became behaviorally modern when they could reliably transmit accumulated informational capital to the next generation. and transmit it with enough precision for innovations to be preserved and accumulated. So this would take both a high enough population density and the ability and willpower to communicate ideas. So in turn, the reliable accumulation of culture depends on the construction of learning environments, not just intrinsic cognitive machinery. So all modern humans, from 300,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago, were hunter-gatherers who hunted wild game and collected wild foods. Their societies were egalitarian in nature, that is, individual status was based on your age, your sex, and whether you were married or not. And leadership in societies like this would have been based on a personal achievement. Most groups lived in mobile to semi-sedentary groups of about 30 to 50 people, at least until nearly 12,000 years ago. By around 12,000 years ago, the end of the Pleistocene and the end of the megafauna, people were beginning to domesticate animals and plants. One exception to this was the dog, which perhaps was domesticated by 20,000 years ago. Populations grew, and the size of groups who settled down grew above 50. And many of the people who turned to the use of domesticated plants and animals became more sedentary. And we see much more regional variation in the cultures. So changes and differences by territory of the ways and styles that artifacts were made. Next week, after Test 2, we will begin with a brief look at modern-day human variation before talking about race, and then beginning to talk about cultural behavior, beginning with Upper Paleolithic art and symbolism. So where did Homo sapiens arise? 3 models have been proposed on the origin of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and we'll go through each of these briefly. The multi-regional evolution model, the recent African origin model, which has also been called the out of Africa model or Eve model, and the mostly out of Africa model. The multi-regional evolution model states that Homo erectus originated in Africa and spread out into Europe, Asia, and more of Africa, and each of these local Homo erectus populations around the world evolved regional differences in response to their local environmental conditions. However, although regional differences developed, gene flow was substantial enough so that they all stayed one species over the 2 million year length of time that Homo erectus was living. And populations of Homo erectus then, worldwide, simultaneously evolved into modern Homo sapiens, retaining local differences that had already developed among Homo erectus in that area. This is now discredited. The recent African origin model states that only one archaic Homo or Homo erectus population in Africa evolved into modern Homo sapiens, who then spread outward from that geographic area. And as they spread, they encountered other archaic Homo populations elsewhere, and they replaced them. That is, they did not interbreed with the archaic populations in each area. They took over genetically. The hypothesis or model that we'll stick with is the mostly out of Africa model, which states that Homo erectus spread out of Africa across the world. Modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa and then spread out. But as they encountered these other spread out populations of Homo erectus and/or archaic homos, there was gene flow, and it was not restricted in one way. So that present genetic variability in different places of the world reflects both local older developments and more recent African developments. So in other words, anatomically modern Homo sapiens interbred with the local archaic populations, as we know they did with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So anatomically modern Homo sapiens are present by 300,000 in Africa and by 28,000, all humans everywhere in the world were anatomically modern. Nowadays, we have both genetic evidence and fossil archaeological evidence. Based on current human genetic variability, it's thought that around 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens population size in Africa dropped, that Homo sapiens was nearly wiped out. Estimates vary that they dropped to just 8,800 people in total, or even somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 people. Alternatively, another researcher proposes that current human genetic variation is the product of a very long history of small population size in equilibrium. And in fact, Hawks and others do not see consistent evidence that supports a huge population drop 200,000 years ago. Modern genetic evidence, many different forms have been taken. I'll mention here just the mitochondrial DNA. And this shows unequivocally that variation is greatest among African women, suggesting that they have been Homo sapiens sapiens, that is, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, longer than any other populations in the world. And mitochondrial DNA is passed only from female to female. Finally, what can we say about the rate of evolution? Two models have been proposed on the rate of speciation. The first of these is gradualism, which states that change from one species to a new species is slow and gradual. And when enough change accumulates, we scientists decide to call that something a new species. Now, if this were the rate of speciation, what sort of fossil evidence would you expect? You'd expect transitional forms showing gradual change. A second hypothesis or model has been proposed called punctuated equilibrium. This states that a species might have a long period of equilibrium, that is, little to no change, punctuated by a burst of change into a new species. So perhaps a macromutation would cause the sudden burst of change. A macromutation is a mutation with far-reaching results. And we've already learned how just the rate or the timing of when genes turn on and off when a fetus is developing can have huge changes in the end result. What sort of fossil evidence would you expect to support punctuated equilibrium? We'd expect forms with no to very little change for a long period of time and then sudden change. Now, these two models are not mutually exclusive. We believe that we see both gradualism and punctuated equilibrium in the fossil record. For example, bipedalism may be an example of sudden change, indicating punctuated equilibrium. Granted, those early bipeds were not fully bipedal like us. They showed a mosaic of ape-like and human-like characteristics. Nevertheless, being bipedal compared to quadrupedal involves a lot of change. It looks as though perhaps the first Homo erectus was rather a sudden change. And certainly, the 2 million years during which Homo erectus changed very little shows a long period of equilibrium. Whereas for gradualism, we do see transitional forms between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, and we call these archaic Homo sapiens. And furthermore, we see transitional forms between the archaic Homo sapiens and anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Researchers believe that a small population size bottleneck contributed to the speciation of Homo erectus around 2 million years ago. And this small population size would have led to a founder effect, an immediate change in the gene pool. So this sudden change into the new species, Homo erectus. It seems the more we learn, the more questions we have, which is what makes science so fun. the fossil record is scattered and far from complete. Modern genetic studies are helping to clarify what we might expect to find in the fossil record.